Hey,
Is it just the two of us?
but it's being recorded, so I should um, be quiet.
Hooray!
Hi, Jacob. I should
Good to
say
see
the session is being recorded, so
Oh, hello. Let me professionally greet all of you.
yes.
Hello.
Hey, Magdalena. It feels like old times.
It's exciting.
Without
Despite
the
the fact.
virus, though, or less to a lesser extent.
Now?
Sorry.
I'm without the virus, okay.
Yes.
Yes,
Well, I
without
just
the
came off of it, but
I see all of us decided that we needed to wear very sober black clothing for this.
yes.
Sonia, since I guess we can't talk since it's being recorded, so we can't make chit chat. Do you want us to try? Oh, hello, hello. The fashion choice pattern continues. We remarked that we were all like, of course, uncoordinated, we will all wear black outfits for this thing. Like every single person is like, yes. So,
Great to see you all.
Yeah,
Amazing.
really
This
good.
actually worked. I kind of am just like, is this even going to work?
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, Jacob, you wanted to try out the share screens?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
let's do that. Yeah, works.
Hey, look at that.
Perfect. Okay, good.
Okay. I'll try to share mine too, but I'm assuming if yours works, then mine will work too. Do you see that? Yeah. All right.
Yep.
Yes, we see the word shit. Thank you.
Can
I also try just in case?
Yeah.
Hello, Florence.
Yes, hello. I'm so happy to see you all. That's so great.
Yep.
You see it, right?
Yep. Seeing it.
Right. So I leave it. Sorry,
Hello.
stop share.
Hi, Emmanuel.
Hi. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Hi, Emmanuel. Good to
Hi,
see you. We never meet.
Yeah, we don't have time to see each other.
We are so close and so busy. We should organize Zoom more often together.
It's so strange we're on Zoom. brings me back to.
I was gonna say, or
Dr.
not so strange. It's very like
Yeah.
So I don't see
It's
Sarah yet. So
the
let's
wow.
wait for Sarah and then there's Sarah. Okay.
Sarah is actually, I think, the only one who's in Hawaii.
Yes.
Yes. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, yeah, I am in Hawaii. So.
Excellent. So let's wait just a couple minutes for folks to log on and such, and then we'll get started.
I'm sorry, but as I told before, I will have to leave early.
I should have thought to do that, Sonia.
Hi, Rio.
Hello.
All right, should we get started? What do you think, friends? Yeah, okay. Great. So I've been spending time with folks at the UN, so I will say as they do, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening is how everyone begins everything at the UN because there's across so many time zones. Thank you all so much for being here for the launch of the Science in the State special issue of Public Culture, which is serving as a wonderful reunion for this group of people that I got to spend so much time with and miss very much, and also an opportunity for a good conversation. Sort of a few things to say. The issue is open access, and so we hope that that means that it will circulate widely in the world. The essays are up. You can find them if you go to the Duke Public Culture website and look under advanced publication. The essays are there. This special issue emerges out of a year-long seminar on science in the state that was co-convened by myself and Karis Thompson, then at the University of California at Berkeley. And it emerges also out of pandemic and interruption. And so science in the state is the sort of conceptual framework that brought us together, but it was very much a part of our lives, whether or not people could travel, how they could travel, where, wearing what or what they had to wear to travel, whether folks had to have papers to be able to move in space, and lots of things in between. Part of what we were trying to accomplish in this year-long seminar is what we try to do in the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Study, which is to bring people together around a topic across different methods and perspectives to, see what insights we might bring together. As with other theme seminars, this one started with a couple of ideas that Karis and I had, and that really became the emergent sort of work of the entire group over time. Certainly, it's the case that Foucault and others have, reminded us that the state is, an entity that sort of emerges out of statistics, and that there are sort of rules and tools and guidelines and parameters for governing people through the state. But how the relationship between science and the state has come to mean so much more and far beyond statistics. It's come to include behavioral sciences. It's come to include, as the work of statistics has gotten broader, algorithmic perspectives, and we try to capture in the special issue in our conversation those sorts of things and lots of work in between. And some of the work in the special issue also takes up things like the Karis's piece, for example, the WHO, and the actual sort of workaday work of the state and of multilateral organizations in the context of the pandemic itself. So the special issue was edited by myself, Karis, Sonia Van Vicklen, Joy Rohde, Joshua Barkin, Christo Sims, and Diana Graysboard. I think Sonia is here, of course, and I think Josh is here as well. I'm not sure about other colleagues. I want to send greetings as well to members of the Science in the State working group who are online here: Emmanuel Henri, Florence Johnny Catrice, and Rio Morimoto. As well, and then I'll introduce the speakers as we get underway. So thank you all for being here. And I think what we'll do is begin with the presentations. We'll take sort of one question after each one, and then in case people are coming and going between sessions, and then we will open up for a broader discussion at the very end. And so I was going to do unless there's strong other feelings, I thought we might do Sarah, Magda, Jacob, Sonia, or do people have, is that okay? Okay. All right, so in that case, we'll hear first from Sarah Vaughn, who's an associate professor of anthropology at UC Berkeley, and she works at the intersections of environmental anthropology, critical social theory, and science and technology studies. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks. I also realized, Sonia, that I'm actually using an IAS pen, not on purpose. It just happens to be. So it is what it is. So thanks for putting together this forum. I do happen to be in Hawaii, so bringing the force here. With that said, my project itself, this question of how it is that finance is shaping questions around climate governance and the ideas around the production of knowledge, particularly for states in the global South that have traditionally, as at least understood from international forums such as the UN, have been frankly without data. So how is it that one can think about, one being states or even these international governing institutions, think about encouraging and integrating global South states into projects specifically around climate adaptation? And one way in recent years that has happened is through the influence and use and utilization perhaps of the insurance and reinsurance industry to help develop data infrastructures for the said projects around climate adaptation. So part of the issue then is to understand how it is that the corporate sector is becoming central to the ways in which states themselves are engaging issues of climate governance. So the paper itself tries to look at specifically how reinsurance and the insurance industry has decided, at least in a political and ethical claims around data infrastructures, particularly the development of databases for collecting data for catastrophe modeling, as well as data for states to start to begin to think about what kinds of projects, usually farming projects or infrastructure projects at the national level for climate adaptation. So one of the things that I found really interesting in the ways in which insurance and reinsurance industry, and to take a step back for a second, the reinsurance industry basically are firms that provide insurance to insurance companies. So the reinsurance industry sort of stands above or on top of insurance firms themselves, and they become sort of the middleman for helping to move capital around, as well as information and basic expertise around catastrophe modeling, as well as what could be used for the diversification of insurance products. So reinsurance firms have really been a pivotal player for such programs as the UN projects for developing and global South context for climate adaptation, if only because historically they've had so much expertise around what it looks like to do CAT modeling. So one of the projects that got off the ground through the UN in conversation with reinsurance firms was to develop this database. And so reinsurance firms understand their role is not just sort of this, oh, we're providing expertise, but for them on their part within their industry, they understand their work as around addressing and contributing to what's understood as ESG or these new kinds of social corporate responsibility models. And so ESG stands for environment, society, and governance. So part of the work for these reinsurance firms working with these UN projects for climate adaptation is to suggest that they're contributing on their end to building better communities, offering their investors projects for which they can put their names behind and backing to say that they're contributing to a quote, either net zero or a kind of more resilient climate global future. With that said, though, part of my critique, or at least response to how the reinsurance industry then is engaging these UN projects for database development to bring about these new insurance products in the global south for climate adaptation, is to suggest that they're also managing their own kind of professional identities and ethos, and particularly around an ethos of stigma, and how it is that the corporate sector itself can understand its relationship to growing problem that they are contributing to, but at the same time see themselves as having expertise that they can offer to, quote, fix a problem around climate change. So through the article, I try to theorize stigma as not just kind of a social identity as such, understood through human bodies, as say Goffman would have, and many social scientists following have offered, but also kind of a material reality that plays out through sort of the transaction of not just sort of data itself, but also people, or also professional reputations, and how it is that different sorts of sectors of the reinsurance industry and the key sectors of reinsurance as well as insurance are underwriters, brokers, and actuaries. How those different sorts of sectors of the industry try to present themselves as well as engage the development of these said data infrastructures that are important to sort of proving their commitments to ESG and more broadly these UN projects. And sort of what you see is that at the end of the day, there's no sort of stable way in which these firms understand their reputation and their commitments to ESG, and that ESG is actually quite a moving target, and that it's a kind of ping pong relationship between the UN and the corporate sector in terms of how they address climate adaptation, climate change on this sort of global scale, while trying to respond to these broader market incentives such as ESG to make climate governance happen. So ethnographically in the article, for example, one of the projects which has engaged kind of a more humanitarian bent for collecting data from different global south contexts tries to think through what it means to have, I'm trying to remember the concept right now, but this concept in insurance about the ways in which people are sort of understood to be not so much vulnerable, but kind of a population that doesn't have much insurance to back itself. But the concept is escaping me in the moment. But the idea is that reinsurance sector has to play with different sort of categories of data in order to make visible to UN workers, usually who already have this sort of expertise of what it means to think about vulnerable populations, from interventions in war, humanitarianism, biodiversity, or development sectors. And so there's this interesting sort of dynamic of translation between UN practitioners and the corporate sector in reinsurance in order to understand what does it mean to count different populations as stigmatized and vulnerable, and at the same time understand your expertise, whether from the UN context or the corporate context, is actually addressing the vulnerable or stigmatized population at hand. So I mean, the short end of the stick is just to say that I think stigma, like a lot of other sort of identitarian categories, whether it be from the position of the individual subject, or in this case, the corporation, is very much a performative identity that takes shape through not just kinds of social relations, but also ethical relations, as well as, of course, material relations as they play out through the collection, management, and production of data, and specifically databases in this case. I think more broadly what that means when we think about climate governance is that the corporate contract is becoming, I wouldn't say supplementing, but becoming an important sort of a companion idea of what it means to think about a kind of social contract when thinking about what climate governance can look like between the state and other kinds of entities. Because arguably, I would say, especially based on my past research, is that there's no assumption, one can't make an assumption necessarily about who is responsible for enacting climate governance and the kinds of data and expertise needed to make changes in the world. I think a lot of people would naturally want to think it's the state, and that's how it's played out, I think, thematically for the past 10, 20 years through climate adaptation projects. But, slowly as we see through these different kinds of UN projects that position loss and damage as important to the concepts and words and language used to think about climate governance, the corporate sector is becoming a bigger player. And it's starting through this language and professional identities around insurance and reinsurance. And for them, the stakes are very much about protecting their reputation, and how that could be understood through this logic, I would argue, of stigma, and how it is that different kinds of social corporate responsibility and models allow them or close off access for them to engage these said kinds of UN projects. And the last point I will make is that I do think it's important to say close off, because at the end of the day, right, part of this work for insurance and reinsurance is creating wealth and assets and making sure that that wealth and assets can move around. So part of that local language for them is about how does one diversify where wealth and assets can go. So on the one hand, you can see this as a philanthropic thing for the reinsurance and insurance sector to work with the UN in the sense that they're trying to figure out where can you move wealth and assets to new places. But of course, at the same time, right, that doesn't necessarily take into account, as I track in the article, the governments that are already there that perhaps don't have models for ensuring that insurance and reinsurance sectors can be part of their markets. Again, that's not obvious. Not all governments in the world have legal structures to allow for private markets for insurance or reinsurance, or for that, with that in mind, to have long-term expertise on the ground that can actually capture data and make these projects actually work, right? So that's a broader sort of ethical question as you allow the corporate sector or markets to become entrenched in climate adaptation projects in the name of the UN. What are the different kinds of infrastructures that one needs there? Arguably, at the moment, it's a question of data infrastructures. So, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That was great. So thanks for those that are just joining, we're going to take one question after each presentation, and then we'll come back to a larger conversation. So if you have a question for Sarah, please raise your hand and pose that. And if not, I have a question for Sarah. Okay, great. Sarah, so I wanted to ask about stigma in the state. So the state is not, I mean, about the sort of state as an ethical category in the larger project, if not in the article, and how it is part of the stigma about the state's lack of data. Like, does it to be a state, like, if we're thinking about like the sort of canonical social science work about states and statistics, does the fact that the small Caribbean island doesn't have data or doesn't know how to wrangle the data, like also a part of this moral sort of landscape that you're sort of mapping out in the work?
For sure. And it comes out in an ugly way, but also, in a way that like pushes us to ask really what are the ethical stakes of all this. So, often it is behind closed doors and not during like these, grand summits between the industry and the UN that you hear people actually say those things. I think, to be generous, on the one hand, for a lot of UN delegates or people associated with the UN, it's just sort of common knowledge, and that's why they're there. So it's kind of an unstated or assumed reality. For the corporate sector, they don't even want to touch it because they understand that once they have to ask this question about who are we actually engaging and servicing, they become responsible. And I think there's a kind of cynical understanding of that dynamic of what it means to be part of the corporate sector that hasn't, and that's why the reinsurance and insurance sector is so interesting, because they've had this planetary perspective on what weather has been doing for, centuries now. Like, that's what their work is. And so now all of a sudden that they're being called upon to take account for why the majority of the world they haven't reinvested in for so many centuries. I think they understand across the spectrum from low-level work to high-end work, high level as they call it, that they have been responsible for this gap. But at the same time, they understand, and the language you would hear the responsibility of, oh, those global South countries that we didn't have to care of. Well, there was no assets there. That's not what we do. That's not what we do. That's what governments do. So definitely, they still attribute a lot of the blame or responsibility to states. I think what's playing out now through the UN as a mediator is that they're trying to reproduce or produce ethical relations. So like, what does that mean in the moment to say we're creating an ethics? Not that we're assuming an ethics is already there, which is, I think, as much as a critique in social science or philosophical literature, like you assume the ethics is there. But what does it mean to think about emerging relations? And so like someone like Jared Zeigen, for example, in anthropology, trying to think about like how ethical relations actually emerge through the actual practice at hand, as opposed to thinking through sort of like one would think in, say, a continental philosophy sort of about where you assume the subject or object is already there, right? And they come with certain affordances. So that's what I think is really interesting to your point, Alondra, is that there are these unspoken and unsaid like assumptions about the past of like how people fit in, but now it's this moment of like trying to create these new kinds of worlds. And it's very explicit, right? It's just a question of how people want to engage or not.
Thank you. It's so interesting to hear from the ethnography, the phrase, that's not what states do. Like, it was just be interesting to sort of plumb that and think through that some more. Thank you so much, Sarah. Okay, next we're going to hear from our colleague Magdalena Maleka, who is an assistant professor at the Aarhus Institute of Advanced Studies in Denmark. And our time together at the IAS was previously at the University of Helsinki. Magda is an incredible philosopher of science, but one who also attends to the behavioral sciences as a part of the interesting work of the state and of this philosophy of the state. And we will turn things over to you next, Magda.
Thank you very much, Alondra. I will share the slides with you. So I cannot be as impressive as Sarah in just, giving this talk out of her head. So I prepared in advance the talk with the PowerPoint slides, and I will talk for 20 minutes. So that's as agreed also with organizers before. So let me go, sorry, just a second. Yes, almost there. I'm here. I just share my slideshow, and yes, here we are. All right. So I'm very happy actually that I can share with you some of the results of my reflections on how. Yes, like this. On how behavioral science enters policymaking of many states and public-private organizations. And the reliance on behavioral science in policy setting is often called behavioral public policy or nudging. So some of our guests might have heard these concepts. And this idea of bringing behavioral science to policy gained momentum after just a second, I have to move. After the publication of the book Nudge by the Nobel Prize winning behavioral economist Richard Taylor and the Harvard University professor of law, Kat Sastein. So nudging is aligned with the so-called evidence-based approach to policymaking. So basically the idea is that behavior research provides evidence that allow us to diagnose what are the causes of societal challenges, and then use behavioral evidence to also address the challenges. And the challenges that are often being addressed with the help of behavioral science is poverty, unsustainable consumption, social interactions during pandemics, obesity, or decreasing retirement savings. And what is meant by behavioral science in this context is mostly cognitive psychology and behavioral economics, and also some parts of social psychology. And apart from the fact that behavioral science is brought to policy in order to make states and policymakers to use it in order to influence people's behavior, it also comes with a normative and political justification from the position called libertarian paternalism, right? So there is also this normative discussion going on. So why we actually should do it, and what are the limits of doing something like that, like influencing people's behavior based on behavioral science. So within the libertarian paternalist framework, nudges are understood as public policy technology that allows to guide people's behavior by small changes in the context and they make choices, like that so-called choice architectures, right? And the claim is that is justifiable when this kind of governing or influencing through the choice architecture preserves freedom of choice, and when it brings welfare promoting outcomes, that is wealth, health, and happiness of the population. That's the subtitle of the nudge book, actually. And when I first heard of nudging, I thought of it as a biopolitical project, because the wealth, health, and happiness of population is just clearly, and the idea of influencing behaviors with knowledge and science is a clearly biopolitical idea. So I tried to bring insights mostly from the Foucault's lectures to make sense of the behavioral alternate policy, and I also followed the work of Foucauldian scholars who try to do the same. And it has been an exciting endeavor, but although it took me actually some time to figure out how I can use it in my work. And I will tell you a little bit more about this later, because I think that because of course we can redescribe nudges in biopolitical language and Foucaultian terminology, but I was wondering whether we can do something more than that in order to really understand it. And I think we can, but this will come. But of course, as behavioral policy is informed by behavioral science, I also looked for some inspiration in trying to understand behavioral policy in the discussions on nudging in philosophy of science. And philosophers of science mostly discuss behavioral policy through the concept of evidence, and they also look at randomized controlled trials that are used to test this kind of behavioral policies. So they analyze the epistemological and methodological conditions under which we can reliably predict the behavioral impact of behavioral policies, right? So they basically say, okay, let's use our philosophical apparatus to think under which conditions nudges could actually work. That's a lot of philosophy of science does something like that. I was, however, deeply dissatisfied with this analysis from philosophy of science, as of course they take at face value and do not question the technocratic and indeed biopolitical framing of behavioral policy. And neither they scrutinize the kind of knowledge which is provided by the behavioral science entering policy setting, right? So I realized actually that in many debates about behavioral science and policy, no one really looks at the science itself. No one really tries to ask what kind of knowledge it produces. But at the same time, there are many claims made about this knowledge in the debates, by the proponents of behavioral policies, but also by all those who discuss with them. And proponents of nudges claim that behavioral science provides robust evidence about patterns of behavior being caused by cognitive processes. And this claim is widely accepted even by the fierce critics of nudge. So everyone seems to presume that something like that we know on the basis of that science. But I decided to look actually at the evidence and knowledge produced by behavioral science. And this made me challenge the understanding of behavioral science that is widespread in so many discussions. But before I elaborate on this, let me also mention another motivation for why I try to understand behavioral public policy and the way it is being discussed. So some years ago, I came across a New Yorker piece about Maya Shankar. She is a young professional with a PhD in behavioral science, and she was leading the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences team, which was established in 2015. And this New Yorker piece reported about the attempts of the social and behavioral science team to bring in insights from behavioral science to address some aspects of the public health crisis in Flint. That started in 2016 after the city's water supply was contaminated with lead. And what I found really puzzling about this case is that the social and behavioral sciences team under the Obama administration was really well aware of the social and political complexity of this public health crisis. And, quote, its racial history, its socioeconomic circumstances, all of it, end quote. So that's the quote from Maya Shankar, who's leading this social and sciences, the team, the behavioral science team. And yet, despite this awareness, they would end up proposing behaviorally informed policies, such as reminders on when, where, and how to change water filters, or they would come up with a song about correct water use, right? And these proposals were rather trivial, to say the least. And in my view, they were also humiliating, actually, to the inhabitants of the city affected by the crisis. So I kept asking myself, and I keep asking myself, whether there is something in or about behavioral science, that is cognitive psychology, Tversky and Kahneman, behavioral economics, and parts of social psychology, which does not allow to come up with any better or truly socially progressive policies. And I also keep asking myself, and keep asking myself, why so many well-intended, intelligent, and well-educated people do not see the obvious limitations of what they can actually do with behavioral research and policy. So I don't really have nice answers to these questions yet, but I think I have some suggestions on how to start approaching them. So I looked in my work at discourses and discussions about behavioral policy, and I realized that they actually operate within something that I called imaginary of behavioral governing. So I proposed this notion. So this term is inspired by Foucault's writing on governmentality and the STS concept of socio-technical imaginaries, which is used to analyze how science and technology are invoked to define and design political and social projects. Clearly, nudging is a political project of libertarian paternalism, and it is defined by references to the current state of the art in behavioral research, and that's why it's kind of that. It resembles social technical imaginary in this sense. But what the Foucauldian inspiration for my definition of the term that I will give you in a second comes from his notion of governmentality that many of you know very well. He used this concept to refer to historical shift in modern Europe from feudalism into administrative states during 15th and 16th centuries in Western Europe, as well as to a certain form of governing constituted by a relationship between power and knowledge that emerged during this shift, right? So he understood governing and government as the conduct of conduct. We know this very well, but let me just repeat it or remind you, or just bring it here so that I can continue with the way in explaining how I want to refer to this. So so the conduct of conduct means shaping, guiding, affecting the conduct of some person, of persons, based on the knowledge of who and what are to be governed. And in the so-called governmentality lecture, Foucault made the following remark, and this is I would like to just read very quickly the quote from the slide. In contrast, because it's almost like I read it, but it almost sounds like a guide to nudging, really. So it's a fascinating quote in that sense. So he says, in contrast to sovereignty, government has as its purpose not the act of government itself, but the welfare of the population, the improvement of its condition, the increase of its wealth, longevity, health, etc. And the means that the government uses to attain these ends are themselves all in some sense immanent to the population. It is the population itself on which government will act, either directly through large-scale campaigns or indirectly through techniques that will make possible without the full awareness of the people, the stimulation of birth rates, the directing of the flow of population into certain regions or activities, and etc. Right? So this indirect techniques which influence the flow of population without the full awareness of the people are exactly how nudging techniques are defined, though in the technocratic terminology of policies behavioral influence. So nudging is indeed a form of governing for the well-being and health of the population based on knowledge about behavioral regularities at the level of the population. And this is the knowledge about different kind of biases that this research is collecting. There are these behavioral patterns at the population level and explanations of these patterns by the cognitive processes at the individual level. So that's exactly how also Foucault thought about politics. It's like acting on the population level, but also by all the knowledge of the individual. And as I mentioned already, this view of behavioral research role in influencing or governing behavior is widely shared by the proponents of behavioral policy and its critics. So it is believed, and that's important, that behavioral science provides knowledge of stable regularities of behavior, and that cognitive processes that produce them, and that policymakers or governments act on this knowledge to change or govern the behavior. And this is precisely the idea, what I mean by the imaginary of behavioral governing. This belief that we have this knowledge at the population individual level, and the government uses it in order to govern. And even though most discussions about nudging are not formulated in Foucauldian terminology, they all presume that behavioral science provides knowledge to influence, govern the behavior of an individual. It has not been recognized yet that this imaginary, that is the view of how policy, that is power, and behavioral science and knowledge are relate to each other, also simplifies the understanding of what we can and cannot know based on the behavioral research. And let me explain this. So, and also before we move there, I think that so basically the point here is that I try to show that in fact what Foucault is doing in his work on biopolitics and then neoliberalism and liberalism, that he's identifying the imaginary of behavioral governing. And that he's basically identifying that at some point there's a certain way of governing through knowledge that appears in the Western Europe, and but I think that what I want to emphasize, that this is an imaginary. He isn't really studying how power and knowledge, how power contributes to the production of knowledge. He's studying how political economists, social thinkers whom he is analyzing were thinking about this relationship. And I think they were exactly thinking about certain imagined relation between power and knowledge, and that also continues until today. And I think the behavioral policy is just a manifestation of it operates within exactly the same imaginary. That's kind of my point. I hope it will be also clear in a second. So because I also so I identified this imaginary within which the discussions operate. But then I looked at the behavioral science itself. That was my kind of philosophy of science work. And the behavioral sciences and what we learn from that, I also work always a lot with history of science. When I try to understand and try to make some philosophical points about science. So the behavioral sciences actually of nudging policies have roots in the cognitive revolution in psychology of the 70s. And so they have roots in particular in the interdisciplinary research setting that merge computer science, cybernetics, cognitive science, and were funded by the US military research agencies during the Cold War era. So the theories in cognitive psychology, which come from this period, and then they inspire also Tversky Kahneman research that then is using behavioral policy, they all presume that human mind is analogous to the computer. They model cognitive processes as procedures of information processing, but they are not causal theories about how cognitive factors influence behavior. And that's precisely what is being claimed about the science in all the policy settings and also in the discussions. And furthermore, the behavioral patterns science and behavioral research are also much less robust than typically learned. And I don't have time to go into details of that, but I published papers on this showing that all the biases are actually pretty context dependent. It's very difficult to generalize them. There are many. Some of them are even artifacts of experimental settings. So their robustness can be questions when you look at the methodology of this work. And okay, so what does it mean then? It means that the project of behavioral policy and nudge rests on a set of widely accepted claims about knowledge provided by the behavioral sciences that is not substantiated in behavioral research. So behavioral policies are promoted, discussed, and even criticized as if we really had the knowledge that the proponents of behavioral policy claim to have. And the imaginary of behavioral governing influences the understanding and the interpretation of scientific knowledge invoked for the sake of governing, nudging behaviors by states and other organizations. The formal theoretical frameworks of behavioral science that provide procedures of decision-making came to be interpreted as relating to human agents which power can act upon. So for instance, like the research of Tversky and Kahneman is interpreted as studying cognitive processes which underlie behavior and as providing a more realistic, as they call it, account of human cognition and decision making. However, this research assumes an analogy between human mind and computer, as I mentioned before. It comes up with abstract, highly formal, algorithmic-like procedures of decision making. So when we look closely at the details of the formal frameworks of this research, we notice indeed the procedures of decision-making that can be performed by the computer rather than an agency of biased human subjects. So I suggest that the imaginary of behavioral governing provides the lenses through which knowledge produced by behavioral science is interpreted as applicable to human agents, as knowledge that also power can frictionlessly work on. So, okay, so what can we then do about all this? So what's the possible point of entry for critique of this imaginary and its effects? So one way to start, that's exactly what I did in my previous work, is to analyze simply the kind of knowledge that is actually provided in behavioral research, and then juxtapose this. And once we understand what we can know on the basis of behavioral research, we can juxtapose this understanding with the imaginary of behavioral governing with imagines knowledge that power could frictionlessly act upon, right? So that's one critical strategy, simply go to epistemological work on behavioral science. I also think that much more effort should be put into analyzing the social and political preconceptions, sometimes called values, that enter this research. I think behavioral public policy is often understood as an attempt to bring science to policy in order to depoliticize societal and political policy agendas. However, behavioral research is not free, as no science is, from value-laden preconceptions entering its at diverse stages of scientific investigation. So I think we need much more engagement with this, many more attempts to try to identify the value-ladenness of that research in order to be able to reflect and identify the politics of it. Because it seems that, and these are the last words, it seems that this is precisely one of the reasons of the sources of uneasiness that we may see when we see exactly the highly progressive people in the behavioral science research unit, which use the science and then they come up with something that really doesn't correspond to their idea. I think that one of the reasons for that may be related, that they use the science which basically enacts different kind of politics, right? That the one that is intended. So I think that we really have to do a lot of more work in order to really detect this politics that is embedded in behavioral science in order to understand whether we can use it, as I said before, in any socially progressive way at all. And I think the idea of the imaginary that still, I think, of course, if we agree that this imaginary of behavioral governing that I identified, like inspired by Foucault and STS scholarship, because the question is, what are the origins of it? And I think it may be the case that one of the reasons why so many, as I said, so many smart people don't really see limitations of behavioral research in the end, is that because they operate within the imaginary. And if the imaginary has strong and it has very long origins, it's very difficult to see that the knowledge that they use and they think provides knowledge that can be usable in the power context. It's really not there in the end. So it is just an imagined direction that comes from the way really power imagines how it could frictionlessly work on subjects. So I think that's the reason why the imaginary operating in so many contexts is one of the reasons why sometimes one can be surprised why there's lack of criticism of this particular public policy applications. So I took a little bit too long, but I just the very last comment. I just believe that in order to understand this kind of phenomena as behavioral public policy, one has to really combine insights across disciplinary boundaries. So I try to do it in my thinking, and I was very inspired by our conversations during the Science and State seminar. So I really think that one discipline, STS or philosophy of science, clearly cannot really capture all the intricacies of it. So I was very happy that we remained in this dialogue during the seminar, and really inspired me also to try to put together also all these influences that were already there, but I was encouraged to try to. So let me end here. Sorry, I took a little bit too long. Thank you.
Thank you, Magdalena. So your mic is a little bit fuzzy. So I don't know if there's something you can do on the sound on your end. We have chance for an opportunity for just one short question for Magdalena before we go to the next speaker, and then we'll come back for a fuller discussion at the end. Please raise your hand if you want to pose a question.
So you couldn't hear me that well?
No, we could hear most of it. It was kind of wobbly in and out, but we heard. I heard most of it, but at the end it got a little bad. Sarah.
So this imagination that you're talking about, do you think that it's constructed out of a kind of Western preoccupation with the self, or a kind of understanding of a relation with others that couldn't initially be attained through behavioral sciences? If that makes any sense. Like, is this imagination about just like in a Foucauldian sense, a kind of a self-disciplining and self-actualization, or is it a kind of imagination that is being projected onto others as an initial kind of philosophical framework?
Well, I think it's a very good question. I mean, it's a very good question, because I think that's exactly the another work that it should be done, trying to really unpack the imaginary and the origins of it, and where does it really come from. So I haven't done really this work. What I did is just I tried to identify that it's there. I think it really is there in the discussion, that it is in behavioral science, but also in so much of a critical discussion. Yeah, I mean, it's, of course there is the self. That's clearly the case. I mean, but one can follow Foucault in thinking of death, but I think I don't really have a good answer, in the sense that I really didn't study that, but I think that's precisely the kind of next step, to try to unpack the imaginary and try to understand, as I said, its force and its origins, right? And try to see, try to understand a little bit more beyond the basically simple Foucauldian framework of the knowledge, because of course here it's a population levels and individual levels. In that sense, there are there are the others, because the population is defined as a certain body that to which some people belong and others don't. So I think there is some of this also disciplinary exclusion in that, in the end, following the Foucauldian way of thinking. But let me stop there. I think it's exactly, I think, the possible way of to go in the next step, I think, for me to really think about this.
Right.
The
And we can
imagination.
come, thanks, Magdalena, and we can come
Thank
back
you.
to that because I have a question about that as well. Okay, so next over to our colleague Jacob Foster, who's a professor of sociology at UCLA and a computational social sociologist who works on, among other things, sorry, I just thought I'd fallen off of Zoom. He works on collective intelligence, artificial intelligence, the evolutionary dynamics of ideas, and the co-construction of culture and cognition. And we are delighted to hear from him talking today about thick and thin and AI, something else I'm also super interested in. Over to you, Jacob.
Thank you so much, Alondra. So can you all see my slides? It's fine. Great. Okay. So I'm really delighted to be here today. What I'm going to offer you is a sort of like Wissenskunst style like performance of the paper. So, okay, I want you to think back to last night. If you're like me, you were doom scrolling again. You may have stumbled upon breathless reporting about the latest advances in artificial intelligence, perhaps the often beautiful images generated by Midjourney, like this image of doom scrolling. But in counterpoint with this credulous praise is a different voice, the voice of critique. And most critique of AI follows one of two lines. The first focuses on the harms of actual existing AI technologies, from facial recognition to credit scoring to deep fakes, to the impact on the arts, creative industries, and creative professionals. And with all due respect to the Actors Guild, most of these harms disproportionately affect marginalized groups. The second line focuses on so-called existential risks of AI technologies, like the comic apocalypse of the paperclip factory. But in years, a third voice has joined this critical polyphony, linking these two approaches. It calls for the development of what Stuart Russell calls human-compatible artificial intelligence, and rightly recognizes the transformational effects of future advances in AI in terms of what they demand for reimagining of the foundations of this field. But its conception of human-compatible is rather thin. It positions the detection and satisfaction of individual preferences as its goal. I want to offer here another vision, one that embraces a thick and demanding world of human capacity, social complexity, and local politics in place of the thin, pliable, universalizing world of individual preferences. Riffing on the political theorist Michael Walzer, who was in turn riffing on Clifford Geertz, I call for a notion of human compatibility that is richly referential, culturally resonant, and above all, locked into a locally established symbolic system or network of meaning. This vision also demands a reimagining of the foundations of AI research, but it requires, in addition, a change in both the core technical paradigms and established modes of technoscientific practice, and it finds another field whose foundation needs to be reimagined, social theory. But before getting to that, I want to give you a quick tour of the best practices of AI as a technoscience. As I'm sure you know, contemporary AI research is utterly dominated by machine learning, in which scientists program a computer to learn to do something. Most advances in AI over the past decade have depended on training larger and larger neural networks on more and more data. Now, training those models is energy and resource intensive. So is collecting and curating the training data, which often depend on uncompensated or poorly compensated labor, whether through surveillance capitalism or so-called ghost work of cleaning, annotating, and labeling those data. It's unsurprising then that this bigger is better demand of the technology is coupled with a distinct social organization of labor. Contemporary ML research is dominated by something called benchmarking. In this research practice, tasks, the things we might want a computer to do, are represented by specific benchmark data sets, and metrics for evaluating the performance of an algorithm on that task. At the end of the day, you end up with the ubiquitous benchmarking table. Now, if you don't know how to read one of these, the bold number tells you which algorithm the authors of the paper developed, which inevitably has the best score. That score is your golden ticket. And this practice was introduced decades ago by funders as a way of better measuring progress in AI, making the science more efficient and effective. Sounds good. And in some ways it is. It coordinates scientists. It's trivial to compare algorithms on the common benchmark. It lowers barriers of entry, but the costs can be substantial. Overfitting models to data sets, researchers without a nuanced understanding of the task domain. And worst of all, insofar as the benchmarks depart from details of the real-world problem, this progress can be illusory, real-world deployments of the technology catastrophic. These disasters often affect marginalized groups, again, whose data are underrepresented in critical benchmarks. So benchmarking seems pretty important. And in collaboration with Remy Denton at Google, Alex Hanna at DARE, and my student Bernie Koch, we conducted the first systematic analysis of benchmarking practices across the field. We found that task communities increasingly concentrate their attention on fewer data sets with staggering levels of inequality in that attention. While they tend to create their own data sets at a reasonably high rate, they tend to use data sets borrowed from other tasks. This borrowing decreases the ecological validity of the benchmark for the task at hand. Most remarkably, we found that a handful of institutions, 12 top universities shown here in orange and tech companies shown here in blue, produce the benchmark data sets that account for the majority of usages in papers across more than 26,000 of them. Just to give one example, these are top data sets in the very controversial face recognition task. We know this task has widely reported problems with racial and gender bias. 4 of the 8 top data sets were funded by corporations, the US military, or the Chinese government, accounting for about 1/3 of the usages. And it goes without saying that these data sets reflect the interests and values of the elite scientists, corporations, and government actors who organize and subsidize their production. So contemporary AI, as a technology and as a field of inquiry, overwhelmingly participates in a modernist political imaginary that favors scale, standardization, and concentration. At best, it can be humanized to detect and satisfy human preferences, but it will never be human compatible, at least not in a thick sense. So what would thick human compatibility look like? What changes might it demand in the technology underpinning AI? Well, here are a few thoughts drawing on James Scott's essays on anarchism. This anarchist squint helps us see more clearly the perils of contemporary AI and associated research practices. Drawing on Scott, I'm going to make some claims, some provocations. First, that human-compatible AI should be against standardization and for the vernacular. Now, it's in the nature of modernist institutions to crush local variation in the name of standardization and legibility. But vernacular traditions, knowledges, practices fit local circumstances better in ways that become apparent only too late after they've been swept away in the modernist tide. This current trend in AI research is human incompatible insofar as it rests on massive data sets and gigantic foundation models, standard centrally produced solutions to core algorithmic challenges that serve as building blocks for larger systems. This mode of AI practice demands standardization and legibility. Massive benchmarks, the foundation models trained on them, also impose a particular semantics. Later, any person or organization needs to interface with these systems benefits from aligning with their way of seeing the world. The vernacular world deforms to fit the standardized infrastructure that is fundamentally anti-human. Far better is an AI that learns to represent the vernacular, that can translate between these local worlds, embrace human dynamism and ambiguity. This thick approach demands data-efficient AI systems that can learn from a handful of examples. It prizes transfer so that standardization and scale become irrelevant, and it pushes against the dominance of a handful of benchmarks, urging a variety of data sets carefully tailored to the local world where the system in question will operate. Second, human-compatible AI should be against one goal and for many goals. As Jane Jacobs realized long ago, many of our institutions and organizations involve many objectives, yet the modernist mind decides what the one goal should be and maximizes it. That same defect is reflected in benchmarking, which emphasizes performance on one metric when assessed against one standard data set. It's on display when researchers carve up the world into tasks in the first place, never mind the fact that the same situation might mean radically different things to different people. Now, Stuart Russell and other mainstream human compatibility researchers are right to start by acknowledging the diversity of human preferences, the fact that they need to be learned, not imposed. But the notion of preference is far too narrow. Thick human compatibility requires a way to talk about the different meanings humans make, as well as the radical challenges of reconciling different preferences, values, meanings, and projects. This goes far beyond just a weighted sum of different objective functions. It requires a new, more human vocabulary at the foundation of AI research. It requires an understanding of preferences and objectives as co-constructed, dynamic, context-dependent, negotiated. Without such vocabulary and vision, the dystopian tendency in current AI technologies could produce a grid of preferences that are imposed, static, universal, non-negotiable, Philip K. Dick's Black Iron Prison. Third, human-compatible AI should be against the use of humans and for the production of human capacity. Now, organizations and institutions shape the people that participate in them. We all know that. That can be good or bad. Consider a student who enters economics graduate school. She starts a very sensible person. By the time she graduates, she would, and this is true, sacrifice part of her thumb, pass the knuckle, to publish in a top journal like AER. This transformation makes her fit better into the discipline, but is it good for her in the long run? Is it good for science in the long run? We have to ask the same questions about AI systems. The notion of Hicksian income, introduced by the British economist John Hicks, gives us one way to think about these questions. It essentially says that when you evaluate a firm or an organization or so forth, you need to track what happens to its production. If it's damaging them, if it's destroying climate, degrading the soil, reducing the capacity of the labor force, attenuating their ability to participate in civic life, that counts against it. And we're just beginning to ask those sorts of questions about AI systems when it comes to people or the many other factors of production they currently consume and degrade, from climate to culture. It's entirely possible to satisfy preferences while ultimately degrading people. In fact, pure preference satisfaction is very likely to do this. That's why Odysseus in the story famously lashed himself to the mast. His preference when hearing the siren song was to dash himself and his ship on the rocks. It's likely that the preferences being constituted and satisfied by current AI technologies are degrading our mental health, our attention, our capacity for civic participation. We're dashing ourselves on the rocks each day. Human-compatible AI, in the thick sense, must put human flourishing at the center of its evaluative calculus. It must build human capacity, not destroy it. But what sort of capacity and who decides? This brings up the last theme, that human-compatible AI needs to be against interpretability and for politics. Modernist institutions love objective quantitative schemes of evaluation and classification, SAT scores, H indices. As Scott tells us, these are anti-political devices. They seek to translate questions of judgment, debate, disagreement into judgment-free, unbiased procedures. But as those metric schemes and categories are established, politics are smuggled in. Nor is the transparency of those schemes a defense. The politics comes in their construction, not their application. Once they're available for everyone to transparently examine, it's too late. Contemporary AI technologies indulge in this same anti-politics. Now, early critique targeted the opacity of AI classification, for example. The field-wide response, which was to promote interpretability or explainability, is insufficient, at least in its spare form. It's algorithmic misdirection for the same old sleight of hand. You learn how to play the game, but the problem started long before the game started. The rules have been rigged. What's the broader point? Human-compatible AI should be avoiding the creation of anti-political machines and instead promoting healthy debate and deliberation, informed by, but not excessively deferring to, expertise. This is especially so when it comes to the allocation of scarce resources or grave harms. So thanks to our anarchist squint, the perils of contemporary AI, I hope, have become clear. It's the same old modernist drive to uniformity, legibility, scale, stasis, yet that drive is especially perilous in its AI incarnation because of the unprecedented capacity of those technologies to reach into and rework our local worlds of meaning. Because current AI practice demands computer power, massive data sets, considerable resources, the modernist drive is allied of necessity late capitalist impulses towards scale and concentration. So contemporary AI risks making the world thin, lacking in reference or cultural resonance, floating free of locally established symbolic systems or networks of meaning. To see what this means, what's really at stake, I turn to a distant discipline, evolutionary biology. We can see both AI systems and the humans subject to them through the lens of adaptation. Adaptation, in the language of biology, is any process that leads to a greater fit between a system and its world. It has two faces, one of which we often forget. On the one hand, the system can change to fit the world, as in learning or sort of normal evolutionary dynamics, or the system can change the world to fit it. This is the process known as construction, action that changes the environment. Animals do it, humans do it. Construction makes the world more predictable, more legible. It can change others' behavior to benefit the constructing system. And humans, whether individuals or groups, deploy both approaches to adaptation. On the one hand, we learn the features, concepts, categories, norms of our physical and social worlds, but we also construct our worlds to suit our ends. Informal norms are an excellent example. They render our social worlds more legible and learnable by reducing the vast space of possible social actions. And in many cases, especially when norms are vernacular, their details are the products of and subject to continued local negotiation. And the same is true of many other forms of niche construction, whenever they're thick in Walser's sense, whenever they're co-constructions whose authors vary only so much in their power, that is, their ability to impose learning on others and construct environments to their advantage. Thin niche construction is the product of vast power disparities. The local, complex, political cannot be sustained when some have the power to construct the social world while others must learn to the choices and adapt to the choices of the powerful. The power disparities inherent in AI and its capitalist implementation make it an instrument of thin construction. So what does it mean to construct the world? Well, in the language of machine learning, it's to change the objective function, the recipe that tells me the outcome of doing this action in this situation. Insofar as people care about those outcomes, they will learn to take actions that lead to higher value according to that objective function. You can see, I hope, where this is going. As AI systems have more and more influence on our objective functions, they can shape our behavior quite invisibly, but they can also shape our semantics, the way we assign meaning. In the spirit of, say, pragmatist theories of social action, you can define some action map that sends a situation S to an action A. That could be literal actions. Do I buy something? Do I sell something? Or labels, hot dog, not hot dog. Now, on an admittedly very pragmatist reading, the meaning of a particular action, like the label hot dog, is the subset of situations that produce such an action. So if our set S is a set of images and the action is the label hot dog, what the action means, what the action map means by the action hot dog is the set of images it labels hot dog. So this could be actual hot dogs, veggie hot dogs, but maybe also people in hot dog costumes, the Oscar Mayer Wienermobile, and so on. Whoever controls the objective function, whether a government agency or an AI-driven platform, begins to control meaning. For a given objective function, there will be some action map that leads to optimal value. And this optimal map then leads to a sort of optimal semantics for any particular action. So if the action map is being used to select food items for purchase, the corresponding objective function might penalize mislabeling of non-food items with food labels. The optimal semantics in this case would, for example, limit the meaning of hot dog to the food item, excluding the inedible but indelible Oscar Mayer Wienermobile. So in the world of thick construction, objective functions and thus meanings are debated and co-constructed. Objectives and meanings are multiple, overlapping, at times contradictory. In the world of thin construction, overwhelming power, the ability to impose an objective function, leads to semantic power, the ability to impose meaning. The force of semantic construction is amplified in the case of contemporary AI because it relies on a handful of key data sets and foundation models, reducing the variety of objective functions, action maps, and hence semantics that construct our world. And so is the world made thin. Semantic power dilutes rich reference, deadens cultural resonance, abolishes local symbolic systems, and unravels networks of meaning. I hope I've convinced you of the peril in contemporary AI, a capacity to subtly and pervasively reconstruct our social and mental worlds in ways that make even the most ambitious modernist state actors look like slackers. I started by pointing to the roots of this problem in current research practices and technical paradigms and imaginaries in AI. And I share with the human-compatible AI community a conviction that we need to remake the foundations of AI research. But we need more than that. We need to shift human compatibility from its thin foundations in, say, economics. We need a social science for thick human compatibility. Alas, no social science is up to that task. And this is because of how contemporary social science treats change. Old social theories committed an unforgivable sin of necessitarianism. Although acknowledging that the world is socially constructed, they incoherently read into that construction laws of social evolution, with societies proceeding through inexorable stages towards some more or less clearly imagined end of history. The positive social sciences render change with a modesty that borders on timorousness. They help us understand local adjustments around present arrangements, but they don't give us the imaginative resources to envision new possibilities or chart a course from here to there. So where do we turn? How do we imagine these strange new worlds? The great French scholar of religion, Henri Corbin, used the term mundus imaginalis to denote the intermediate world between, quote, the empirical world and the abstract world, the world of abstract understanding. In this imaginal world, he said, there are cities whose number it is impossible to count. In its positive face, social science is too concerned with the empirical world to help us see the worlds that could be. In its necessitarian face, grand social theory confuses categories of the intellect with necessary laws of history. The social science we need to meet contemporary challenge resides in the imaginal, in mapping and navigating the space of possible social worlds. How to begin, how to find these possible worlds? We'll consider the anthropological lineage from Elinor Ostrom and James Scott to the Davids, Graeber, and Wengrow, or the Afrofuturist lineage from Ishmael Reed to our own Alondra Nelson, to Ruha Benjamin. There is a wealth of alternative social worlds on offer in history and at the present. Such worlds begin to populate the space of possible social worlds, and by exploring those sites empirically and formally, we can begin to see more of this mundus imaginalis. This imaginal social science has as much in common with mathematics and with poetry as it does with contemporary social science practice. We must expand our imagination of what the human can be and what humans can build. Only then can we do justice to the questions of what sort of AI will be truly human compatible. I want to thank the IAS for an incredible year, which fulfilled a childhood dream to spend time at the one true platonic heaven. I also want to thank the many artists, unnamed and unknown, whose work trained the stable diffusion models that produced most of the images I used in the talk, and the other artists who cleverly prompted those models into making them. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jacob. That was great. So we have one opportunity for a quick question for Jacob before we come back to the whole group. Sarah's got her hand up, but let me see if there's somebody else who's not of ours. Jack.
Hi all. Hi, it's Jacob. Thank you, and thank you also for acknowledging all of the hidden data behind those mid-journey pictures. A quick one. I'm wondering about the work that's done in taking phrases like human compatible, or even taking words like alignment and trying to reconfigure them in ways that make them generative, that make them productive. And I think the trouble that I have with that mode of engagement is that it still basically fits into a framing of the issues as humans versus robots, rather than allowing us to genuinely engage in a discussion of politics. So can you say a bit more about how human compatibility, and maybe Alondra wants to comment on her sort of retooling of the idea of alignment as well, allow us to deal with plural values, plural human interests, and the politics that come from them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I was rightly chided by my fellow Science in the State seminar members for my clinging to this, very antiquated and underanalyzed category of the human in setting up this entire analysis. I chose to stick with that term in part because I wanted to sort of offer a hand across the divide to the folks in AI who very much use this framing in their conversation. But I actually think if you get into the substance of the argument, very little of it really depends in the same way that actually the narrow human compatibility, preference, satisfaction, and detection kind of framework depends on the category of human. And in fact, I think most of what I argue for in the paper can embrace a set of other than human actors and agencies who might be involved in these kinds of contestations and politics and deliberations, whose values need to be taken into effect, whose projects and meanings need to be part of the conversation. And I mean, in fact, that's something that I personally am very committed to. I lead this Diverse Intelligences Summer Institute that's all about sort of expanding these dialogues to include non-human animals and the natural world more broadly. So yes, I mean, I think this is a compromise that I somewhat willingly made in order to try to get some of the AI people across that first divide and then sort of hopefully walk them a little bit further and deeper into engagement with other ways of thinking about the problem. But great question.
Great. Thanks so much, Jack. And I'll say a little bit before we start the Q&A so I can come back to your prompt there, which I think, as Jacob says, is exactly right. Okay, so our last speaker is Sonia Van Vilkelen, who is professor of anthropology and sociology in the School of Social Sciences and Social and Political Sciences at the University of Sydney. Her research takes place on the cross-disciplinary node of law, life, and science in a globalizing world. Over to you, Sonia.
Thank you, Alondra, and I forgot to mute myself there. Hi, everyone. I'm zooming in from Sydney, Australia, and I'd like to start, and I'm just gonna see how I do this. Yes, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the Darug Nation, on whose land I'm living on and presenting from you today. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to the elders of all First Nations communities. Now, I should also mention that it's still quite early here, and I just came out of my 4th or 5th or 6th COVID infection. So forgive me for sticking to my written text, as I didn't want to risk overtly displaying the amount of brain fog hanging over me. Now, the short title of the essay for the special issue is Shit in Silico. And I so much appreciate the power of the word shit to help me lighten my presentation and to make listeners sit more upright, especially at the end of a session. However, having had Jacob Foster present before me, I realized you don't need shit, you just need the Jacob factor. Anyway, I will be talking about shit literally, not figuratively, as I hope it won't be a shitty paper, but what does shit have to do with science and the state? So I look at the legal governance of fecal matter for global bioscience research. Shit, fecal matter, or stool is becoming very important for microbiome research. The study of microbes in and on our bodies that have proven crucial to our health and even life-saving for people suffering from gut-related diseases. So shit is becoming very valuable as a source of material, but also as a source of information for the life sciences. So I'm super fascinated by this new value of shit. How do we regulate shit when we are used to seeing shit as waste and not as something valuable? Is our shit ours, or is it common good? Can we ethically use other people's shit to better our health? Moreover, while biovalue in global science today often prompts new regulatory principles in the overdeveloped world to facilitate commercialization, in global south countries, they trigger issues of sovereignty. The debate between global sharing and sovereignty in science is a long-standing debate with colonial histories, but they are becoming more and more complicated with the digitalization of biological material. When shit turns in silico rather than in vitro, what are the new stakes of the debate? So let me turn here to the high-level negotiations that took place last year at the United Nations Biodiversity Conference, COP15 in Montreal. The focus of the event was to determine the status of digital sequence information, which is the policy term used for information derived from biological resources and genetic material. Core to the negotiations was the issue of benefit sharing, a central mechanism of the Convention for Biological Diversity, or the CBD, to ensure that countries provide biological material receive due compensation for their contributions to scientific development. As developing countries seek to tether data to the nation state, critics, often represented by developed countries, say instead that data must flow. Forms of biosovereignty, they say, hamper scientific progress. So my presentation interrogates the problem of materiality in assessing bioinformation for benefit sharing purposes. Not to advocate for either data sovereignty or open access, but instead to clarify the different skills at work in thinking about the materiality of bioinformation. I do this by focusing on data extracted from human stool for research on human gut microbiome, which is, as we are probably all aware of by now, a pioneering bioscientific field with great promise for tackling various diseases. I examine how stool transitions from in vitro to in silico analysis. So in other words, how are fecal materials turned into metagenomic sequence data. I ultimately argue that the dematerialization of stool is simultaneously accompanied by processes of rematerialization that thicken metagenomic data. And here comes the term thick again that Jacob alerted to in his presentation. So in the same way that the anthropologist Clifford Geertz used thick descriptions to interpret cultural information, the thickening of data in microbiome research occurs through a post-genomic context informed by the following three conditions which structure my presentation. So one, the epistemic infrastructure through which scientists interpret microbiomic data. The challenges microbiomics bring to regulatory capitalism. And three, the post-colonial materiality of microbiomic knowledge. These conditions, I argue, demand critical reflections on the governance of scientific exchange in the era of digital biology, one that goes beyond the polarized present that posits data sovereignty on the one hand and Mertonian scientific commons on the other. So, scholars from the social sciences and humanities have characterized microbiome research as a post-genomic science. This classification reflects changing conditions of knowledge production following the Human Genome Project. Here, the life sciences entered a new phase in their research methodology, their scientific labor, and their funding structures. So the massive expansion and intensification of sequencing technologies are main drivers of the post-genomic condition and bring multiple forms of uncertainty to the status of biomaterials and data. They lead to new challenges in the valuation, classification, and provenance of data itself and of their providers. Now, within microbiome studies, human stool samples are sequenced for large-scale computational research on the human microbiome. These technologies have radically changed the science, transforming what kind of knowledge is legible valued, and calculable. Now, in her ethnographic study of microbiome research on infant malnutrition in Dhaka, the anthropologist Amber Benezra describes the datafication of microbes and points to how metagenomic technologies turn Bangladeshi children's bodies into data for translational research in the hopes of finding a technological fix for malnutrition. Here, social behavior and circumstances concerning infant malnutrition in Dhaka were morphed into computed data that made available for analysis and prediction. But contrary to the assumption that data is freestanding and neutral, the microbiomic data described in Benezra's study is valuable only in connection to information about the diets, health, and local lives of the subjects in Bangladesh. So the connection between data and place and between data and scale is vital in terms of scientific value. While the data travels to databases and becomes untethered from its local origins, scientists assessing the data tether them back to certain localities, depending on the research questions and the new context they put the data in. The origins of data become relevant when scientists seek to validate the quality of their claims. Now, what happens here is that information attached to these localities become aggregated with the microbiomic information, thereby molecularizing environments. Once contexts become integral to the microbiomic data collected, the social becomes part of the biological. Geographers speak of the mapping work that is inherent to postgenomic sciences. In what comes next, I explore how this spatial mapping operates within structures of value. So in contrast to genetic researchers who must undergo many ethico-legal hurdles to collect DNA samples, particularly from indigenous communities, it is still relatively easy for human microbiome researchers to collect stool samples. Shit is ubiquitous and free. It is not extracted from the body like a kidney for transplants or a swab for DNA cells, nor does it have the cultural appreciation that is attached to human blood, placenta, or breast milk. While in many jurisdictions feces is considered biowaste, legal scholars advocate changing the legal definition of stool to be included as human tissue, arguing that stool may hold value similar to placenta and human breast milk. The legal recognition of stool as biologically one's own would ignite the same kind of ethical debates presented by human tissue, where the question whether one owns one tissue is inextricably informed by a legal philosophical attachment to human individuality. Yet the very idea of human individuality is changing amidst the post-genomic biosciences. Scholars in the social study of science have shown how microbiomics disturbs traditional notions of humanness and biological personhood. The human microbiome is a more than human or multi-species affair, involving the life and labor of tiny organisms, trillions of microbes inside the body, and their dynamics vis-a-vis environmental conditions outside of the body. So in true Latourian manner, microbiomic data, like ferment in the pasteurization of France, becomes a substance that specifies the stability of an assemblage. Rather than hiding true information about the self, microbiomic data develops into an institution held together by technoscientific and local practices. The challenge for public regulation, then, is how to govern microbiomic data as a spatio-temporal assemblage, rather than as information attached to an individual. But assemblage thinking brings serious complications to the economy of microbiomics and to the regimes of intellectual property underpinning contemporary bioeconomies. Mario Biagioli and Alain Potage describe in this respect how in patent law, in silico processes are upsetting the figure of nature, which is central to law's demarcation from culture. Precision medicine a target of much microbiome research, illustrates this move clearly. The diagnostic testing involved in precision microbiomics, for instance, are based on the discovery of information about the diversity of certain microbiomes, rather than the creation of curative microbiomics. So in other words, the discovery of a particular formation of microbiota is the invention. So here, the commodification doubles down on the spatial aspects of research. This is because post-genomic biosciences depend on a cybernetic logic that understands nature as diagnostic information used to fine-tune therapeutic procedures. And this is Biaglioli and Potash. In other words, the economic incentive informing microbiomic data, articulated through spatial mappings of distinctive microbiomes, directly frames scientific inquiry. Now, my final reflection concerns the post-colonial politics of such spatial aspects. There are strong indications that less diverse microbiomes are linked to metabolic disorders that are prevalent in Western populations, but not as widespread in subsistence economies and are even absent in hunter-gatherer communities. Over time, the gut microbiomes of people in overdeveloped countries have progressively endured the digestions of sugars, fats, and proteins. So pre-industrialized microbiota are key to curing these industrialized bodies, leading to what Ben Ezra calls the bioprospecting of indigenous guts. Rather than reproducing the developmentalist imaginary that portrays transitions from subsistence economies to industrial economies as inevitable progress and enlightenment, we witness a reverse pathos, a reverse colonial pathos in the domain of microbiome research. Yet, while reversed, the racialized dimension remains intact in the post-colonial rendering of microbial difference. As the transition from a subsistence economy to an industrial economy robs industrialized bodies of their capacities to metabolize efficiently, the microbial knowledge of other bodies is put to work to remedy these pathogenic instances. In concluding my thoughts, one can detect here the construction of a post-colonial materiality, where microbiomic data is not only tethered to spatiotemporal contexts, those that affect metabolism, but also folded into scientific, biomedical, and global health practices that continue to operate on a colonial logic. Bringing these matters back to the question of governance, the bioprospecting of other bodies through the datafication of their microbiomes creates a paradoxical situation. While global health imperatives continue their modern pursuits of hygiene, sanitation, antibiotic treatments, and deworming in the South, scientists and pharmaceutical companies use microbiomic data from these very same localities to carve out new markets for probiotics, prebiotics, and helminthic therapies. Microbiomic data then toggles between competing narratives of humanitarianism and economy, scientific progress and global inequality, bioprospecting and biopiracy, and data sovereignty and open science. New understandings of bioinformation bring to governance new challenges, both for intellectual property rights and for benefit sharing arrangements. Here, microbiomic data and bioinformation in general should not be regarded as raw, untethered, or neutral, but instead in need of careful attention and analysis to see how information relates to complex histories, cultural contexts, and biosocial environments. Shit in silico proves more fungible than in vitro forms. And care or genuine ethics is often the first to perish in the pursuit of fungible commodities. An important step would be to see how we can enlist and implement materiality into new forms of legal instruments, designed not from a desire to access or control, but from a desire to relate and cohabitate a more just world and sustainable planet. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Sonia. Fantastic. Bravo. Okay, so I have a few kind of observations to make in brief before we get started. We've only got about 15 minutes for conversation. And lest we run out of time, I'm going to start with a few thank yous, and then I'll make just a few kind of remarks I think that crisscross across several of the papers, and then we'll invite broader conversation, invite people if they wish to turn their cameras on, raise their hands, and we'll get started with conversation. So I wanted to, before at the top here, thank 4S President Emma Kowal and President-elect Ann Pollock for allowing us to have this special issue launch as part of the 4S, and also for allowing us to do it on Zoom across these various time zones. We really appreciate it. And to the program, the 4S program committee, that was really helpful. I want to also thank the Sloan Foundation, which the subvention of which is allowing us to make the special issue open access for people to read. And we hope that people will take advantage of that and circulate and share and read the work. So kind of a few, maybe I have like sort of 3 or 4 bullet points here that tie a few things together. One, I was interested in that, and actually I think the beauty of the launch event is that we've read these essays together, we've worked together, but yet still there are these fresh connections that come out of the conversation that hadn't existed before, which is really interesting and exciting. So I wanted to pose the category of sort of state incapacity. So I was thinking of Sarah's the state can't do that as both a question and a kind of exclamation point. And also pose that to a question to Magdalena about your very persuasive framing of a very complex social issue, thinking about the Flint crisis, reduced to kind of trite interventions. And again, is this a question of the state can't do it? So is this the only way the state understands, in your reading of the New Yorker piece, which I haven't read in ages, the state state actors are saying that they understand it's deeply complex, but this is what the solution that they can offer, right? And so is it about the lack of capacity in the state, or that we imagine the state can do? And is that about actual operational capacity, or is that about political capacity, which goes back to Jacob's question? I think the political in kind of a realpolitik way is something sort of that we should be thinking about here. A question for Magda also is a kind of classic sort of history of science one, is sort of how behavioral science became science. And does the state certifying it as a science make it more scientific? So is there, if we're thinking about that classic Foucauldian relationship, or that relationship between state and statistics, does the state finding use for the nudge and for the behavioral science allow it to sort of pass this threshold into more scientific? Because I think there are some people who understand their work to be science that would not think that behavioral science is scientific in the least. And so it's interesting how it's been brought into the work of the state in that particular way. In a linking Jacob to Magda, I was thinking about the question of, with an asterisk to Jack's really important intervention, how the state can support thick human compatible research or human compatible science. Given what Magda is suggesting, that states have a tendency to be thin, so the response to the Flint crisis is the most thin and the most trite. Is there some investment that we want the state to have in supporting thick human compatible AI, or sort of thick analysis more generally? I was interested as well in Jacob's, sort of was a kind of just not quite a throwaway line, but a line that you said and kept going about thin construction supporting capital, sort of, or thin construction and capital. So how does thin construction support capital versus a kind of thick construction? Because Magda shows in her work how thinness, how triteness, how a kind of narrow framing supports the work of the state. This is a thing that we can do. We can create a commercial or a movie about water, rather than solving the kind of deep structural, historical issues that are happening. So Sarah and Sonia, I thought it would be interesting to put you in conversation about this idea of data, that data must flow. And I was struck by, again, this question: what is the state's job? And what is the state's job? I was also thinking of the quote that Magda pulled from Foucault about sovereignty and the shift from sovereignty to governmentality. in Sonia's paper, you have the collapse of the two around data. So there's both an attempt for the state to regulate what's the state's role with regards to SHID and silico, and also is there a nation state sovereignty around sort of biomass and biomatter in a particular way. And then Jacob, Sonia, Sarah, all sort of circling around data in a particular way. Jacob, for obvious reasons, very much brought us to that critique number one about data bias and about discrimination in data. I was struck in Sarah and Sonia about a lack of a consideration of discrimination in data. I mean, Sonia got to or bias in data sets. So Sarah's about the constitution of data sets as a necessary capacity for the state working with capital and this kind of ESG terrain, but a lack of critique around the formation of the data itself, at least, or maybe that's part of the sort of ethical piece. And Sonia, I think similarly, there's some conversation around the diversity of the different omics and the communities of the local context from which they come, but not a kind of fundamental, I think, conversation or critique about the fundamental lack of full representation of any of these data sets. So those are just some of the issues that I wanted, a few threads I wanted to raise that people can respond to or not. And again, I invite others to raise their hands and jump in and share their, and jump on screen if they would like to as well. Josh, did you want to weigh in?
Kind of, with trepidation, I guess. It's fascinating for me to hear these papers being presented. And Alondra's summary of them comes back to so many questions that I have still, having been a part of this project for a long time, about the nature of power and the questions around power that animated the project. And so on one hand, we had this category of the state that appeared in various, obviously, it's one of our major themes in unifying these papers. But then the modes of power, if we switch from the state as an institution to the modes of power present in these diverse projects, there's a number of ways that power is operating that are state-like, state-ish, maybe state-esque, I don't know, but are not really through the institutions of states. And so some of them are kind of classic Foucauldian power knowledge connections. Some of them, I of course am struck by Jacob's map that shows both that collapses universities, many of them publicly funded with corporations that are also the centers of generating these data sets. And so does it matter institutionally whether it's a public university versus a private corporation? And does that take us into questions about property and political economy that are meaningful in thinking about the power of AI? And Sonia's raising the issue of value, that is also a term that has multiple resonances. So I guess for me, the big question is, coming through doing all of this work and all of these discussions is, do we come out of it? I mean, I don't think that there was one simple conception of power. Instead, we ended up with a lot of different ideas about power. And then Alondra raised at the end, well, what does this then mean for the state? Because the state is different in that it has at least the possibility of some forms of democratic power or accountability or legitimacy that might be different from any of those institutions. That's more of a comment than a question. I mean, just really thinking about the modes of power across these topics. And yeah, that's it. Thank you all. They were really great presentations. I enjoyed it. I miss you all.
Thanks for those comments. And Sonia, let me just see if there's one more question or comment from others, and then we'll let you all each answer in turn as we wind up. Any other questions or comments for this brilliant crew? Nay, Kalima?
Yes, thank you for the terrific session. I loved it so much. My name is Nai. I'm based at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And so I'm really interested in thinking about state capabilities and thinking about how can states enhance their capabilities? What kind of policy levers can they do to try and reorganize power and bring it back to the state so it's not hollowed out? And I wanted to know, what do you all see as really the opportunities to do that around your work? Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Okay, so Sonia, why don't we start with you and then we'll go around.
Yeah, I think I'm already unmuted. I have so many things that go through my mind at the moment, but I think I just wanted to make one point is that, and I'm reminded also of Magdalena's paper on, the imaginaries, and I'd like to juxtapose that to practices. So some of these imaginaries are happening and we're trying to critique them, but the problem of critiquing them, and I think Magdalena even alerted to this problem of critique, is the fact that we're needing to look more at the practices themselves. And I'm saying practices, linking it to my own paper, because there are practices of scientists, sharing, having certain etiquettes around sharing data, and I'm alluding to the work of Lyle Fernley here, that circumvent the state. So I'm also wondering to what extent, data, AI are allowing practices to circumvent the state more. And I'm thinking of James Scott work, of the art of not being governed, being, present within this, like modern context rather than not the modern context, which is kind of interesting that the turn to AI, the turn to data, the in silico, the post-genomic are bringing us into this situation where we might circumvent or not be governed. That's my brain haze comment.
Thanks so much. Sarah, any comments or reactions to what folks have said?
I was thinking about Jacob's presentation on the slide that was about interoperability, I think it was. Yes, and with politics. And I was just wondering, because oftentimes when people talk about AI, the point is that AI is no longer having us think about causality, but rather patterns. But politics itself, like as a problem, asks for people to make a claim or some stake about causality. So I'm just wondering, like, for you, as you're thinking about this sort of like alternative for social theory, like, what does that look like? Are you suggesting that we need to start theorizing how politics doesn't always have to be reduced to a kind of claim about causality, which I think is important, right? And also goes to the broader problem with climate change as well, right? Like how we talk about and how we think about and use data for climate change is also not a problem of causality, but rather trying to find patterns within a system, and then how to respond. So I do think that's sort of a damning critique from Foucault on, right? Like we assume a kind of causality to how we think about power, how we think about economy, but in fact, that's probably what was blinding us to broader ways of thinking the world otherwise.
Thank you. Jacob, you want to jump in?
Okay, let me try to touch on as many of these really stimulating things as I can, starting with, this comment that Josh made about whether it sort of matters whether these technologies and data sets are developed in the context of, say, a publicly funded university versus, a private corporation. And, one thing that has to be absolutely acknowledged in this context is the, almost complete entanglement of most academic research in AI with the sort of industrial complex, in the sense that, the scale of not just the data, but literally the, compute needed to train these huge models, et cetera, and not to mention, of course, the economic incentives for their students. I mean, in some sense, it would almost be like quasi irresponsible for a mentor to not like have their students work in a context where, they can do these so I mean, I think there's like an almost perfect complicity that's induced by the nature of the technology itself, and the way that technology is inevitably entangled as a function of its technical underpinnings with capital, scale, so forth. This, of course, pivots immediately to Alondra's question about, the kinds of state investments that would support more thick human or human and other than human compatible research on AI, as well as, Nai's question about thinking about the ways that the state can sort of reorganize power in this landscape and bring some of it back to the state. And, I think a big part of this is how the federal government in the United States, for example,